Hi, I'm Alyden Donnelly, a co-founder of Nori. We're building a privately operated, dedicated carbon removal marketplace where we invite food and fiber producers who have the capacity to draw CO2 out of the atmosphere and store the recovered carbon in soils and root systems to register their projects, verify their carbon claims. We issue them credits we call Nori Carbon Removal Tons, NRTs, and we assist in the sale of those credits over our retail and wholesale market platforms. Nori will be the first market where there's true price discovery, where suppliers and buyers set market price, not the market administrator. And I'll go into that a little more later. I just wanted to give you some context, and basically the message in the next few slides is existing carbon market designs, whether government or private sector administered, are not working. We agree, most scientists agree, that to hold global warming at 2 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, we need to be drawing an incremental reducing emissions, or drawing an incremental 20 gigatons, that's billion tons CO2 equivalent per year, out of the atmosphere between now and 2030. If all of the nations that have made commitments to the Paris 2030 goals achieve those goals, we will still be missing the greenhouse gas reduction target we need to hit by 2030 by 15 billion tons of CO2 equivalent a year. That's if the nations keep their Paris Agreement commitments. But they can't. Why can't they? In climate policy world, we talk about scope 1 and scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, where scope 1 are the emissions from the operations of companies that produce goods and services using fossil fuels. And scope 3 are the emissions their customers have to be able to discharge to the atmosphere to use the products they sell. Well, if we attribute scope 3 emissions to the companies that produce those products, then only 244 corporations worldwide account for 84% of energy and industrial greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. Only 244 corporations. And in fact, of those 244, only 50 account for 57 or 58% of those total emissions. Here is the list of the companies, and broken down into 2 lists. I'll touch on them in a second, mostly just wanting to show you the list is here so you can look them up and see their numbers if you want to. None of those top 50 emitter corporations are planning to reduce their scope 1 plus scope 3 emissions before 2040. And all of them are planning on increasing the aggregate between now and 2030. So if the 50 companies accounting for 58% of all of the emissions we're talking about are increasing those emissions over the next 10 years, it's not possible for all of the individual nations to achieve the reductions that are embedded in their Paris Agreement commitments. That's unfortunately just basic arithmetic. Now, the very interesting thing about the top 50 corporations is here's the list of the first 28, which are 100% state government owned and controlled. And here's the list of the last 22, which are officially publicly traded or privately held companies, of which 8 are still government controlled. So of the 50 companies that are planning on growing their emissions through 2030, and in most cases until 2040, 36 are owned and controlled by governments. And if governments are not going to reduce the emissions in the corporations they control and in their customer base, why should anyone in the private sector? So we're at an impasse here. By the way, 100% of those corporations in their most recent pre-COVID financial reports show that between 2014 and 2018, their scope 1 through scope 3 emissions increased significantly In some cases, and here's Equinor, owned by Norway. Here's an example. In some cases, they realized small reductions in emissions in their own operations, but those reductions were more than offset by emission increases due to their increase in sales of fossil fuel products. So in Equinor's case, between 2014 and 2018, they reduced their operating emissions by 1 million tons a year, but their customer emissions increased by 26 million tons per year. You see this picture in every case without exception. The other thing you see when you go to the annual financial reports and sustainability reports of all of the companies that do publish reports, in aggregate over the population of reporting companies, more than 50% of their capital spending plans is cash being dedicated to fossil fuel exploration and development. So there's nothing in their financial plans that says they're going to do anything. So what do? We have to do something. We got to find 15 billion tons by 2030 to just hold warming at 2 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. And the answer is farmers. This is the Food and Agriculture Organization's wonderful pile of dirt, I call it. And the science community agrees that industrial agriculture practices have depleted organic carbon stocks in topsoil down 30 centimeters from the surface worldwide by 50%. This picture shows you estimates of the existing carbon stocks for the top 10 countries who hold 60% of total stock. This is not perfect, but these estimates you see by country down the right-hand side of the pile of dirt are pretty good proxies for the potential, the absolute potential for each of those countries to draw down and increase carbon stocks in soils, which include croplands, grasslands, and forest lands. If we give ourselves worldwide 100 years to build our soil organic carbon stocks back to the level that they were 300 years ago, while continuing commercial production, we have the capacity, or the food and fiber producers have the capacity, to draw anywhere globally from 10 to 25 billion tons CO2 equivalent out of the atmosphere every year for just under 100 years. That's what we need to control warming, and it's the best solution to the problem I outlined in the prior slides. I won't go through the details. Here are estimates that tell you what the absolute potential seems to be for US croplands plus grazing lands and forest lands. That bottom number, 1.5 billion, is more than enough to offset 100% of US electricity sector emissions if there's no reduction in fossil fuel use by the electricity sector from today's levels. We can talk about in our Q&A time the permanence dilemma and data issues. For croplands, we don't believe the data and quantification challenge is as extreme as people make it out to be. I'm just showing you some ideas that you might want to grab onto for Q&A. What is really, really important to note here is that building back soil organic carbon stocks in farmlands, croplands, and grasslands is the single best investment anybody can make from every perspective. First of all, building back soil organic carbon stocks leads to greater moisture retention, productivity, and soil health. What does that mean? It means one investment serves two purposes: mitigates the risk of global warming and increases the resilience of the land in the event of global warming. There's no other investment you can make that gives you that twofer. There's another thing here. We can build up soil organic carbon stocks by adopting regenerative agricultural practices in croplands while keeping those croplands in commercial production. Most other carbon removal and retention strategies that you hear about involve taking commercial land out of commercial production and preserving it out of commercial production for long periods, or are projects which draw CO2 out of the atmosphere, which projects are only viable if the CO2 drawn, if a good portion of the CO2 drawn out of the atmosphere is then repackaged into energy products that re-release the CO2 to the atmosphere in a very short period of time. So those are carbon neutral projects. They are not carbon negative projects. And we need 15 billion tons a year worth of carbon negative. And nobody could do this more productively and with greater other added values than the world's food and fiber producers. In the Nori market, we ask crop and livestock producers to report to us their operating history. Most of the data we ask for, which is data that we input into the Comet Farm Soil Metrics model that has been developed by the USDA and NRCS. Most of the data we ask for, most farmers have or can get, but it is a pain in the butt. We're finding that it takes the average crop producer 15 to 20 days to gather up all of the data we ask for, either from the shoe boxes in the attic or by phoning up their old suppliers of seed and equipment and asking if they could reproduce historical invoices, which would include the information in many cases we're asking for. We know that farmers don't have 15 to 20 days to spare. So we are working very hard in Nori at automating some of the data capture, so to reduce that that burden for the farmer. For us, the key is to be able to take that data and from that produce soil organic carbon stock trend estimates that come with uncertainty intervals. So you often hear there's too much uncertainty in the data. We're saying no, there isn't too much uncertainty. There's too many estimates that don't come with associated uncertainty intervals. You know, Wall Street's been running a weather derivatives market for 30 years, and there's nothing certain about weather forecasts. The private sector, financial markets, can figure out how to invest efficiently when they know what the uncertainties are, and they can be big uncertainties. They can't invest when we don't know what the uncertainty interval is that's associated with each estimate. So there are many different ways to build this soil market and improve, make it more viable and attract investors. But the first thing is, give me your practices, give me your history, give me your plans. We keep all of your data confidential. We cannot reuse it or resell it for any purpose other than to produce estimates of what's happening in your soil, and then we can attract investment. Nori, in our pilot phase, has been supporting the sale of a small volume of NRTs to date. It's going to expand quickly. Just under 20,000 NRTs have sold to almost 800 individual buyers. The farmer has been receiving a payment from Nori. We process the payments the buyers make of $15 per ton CO2 equivalent for projects that so far have been sequestering between 0.7 and 1.1 tons per acre per year on average. To date in this pilot phase, and I've got to be careful here, pilot phase means our evidence is anecdotal and not statistically relevant yet. But to date, the farmers who've enrolled in our pilot phase have been able to recover not only all of the costs they've incurred, and including putting a value on their time to get enrolled in the marketplace, but they commit to update their operating data reports every year for 10 years and verify them at least 3 times over the next 10 years. And to date, the revenues the farmers have received are also sufficient to cover all of the costs associated with those continuing reporting requirements. So, and generate an additional return on top of that. So we think it's going pretty well.